Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the 2016 international release of the self-titled album from Lukas Graham. You know, I think I've said in the past that music from around the world landing on the Hot 100 is basically a crapshoot. It happens occasionally, but with the exception of huge established acts from Canada like Drake or Justin Bieber, or from the UK like Adele or Ed Sheeran, it tends to be very rare that you get a big smash hit. And it becomes especially true when you look at the more indie-leaning side, as most acts barely have the money to promote themselves within their home country, let alone internationally. However, it gets a little bit more likely when you get an act that gets some traction stateside, and then major labels look to hop on the trend and flesh out their respective rosters with whoever they can find. And obviously they're going to go for Americans first, paradoxically then taking them on international tours before trying to break them into the US market to more test the waters, especially if the European market is more receptive to the sound. But sometimes they're going to get a little bit desperate. Or they'll find an act that's been quietly doing well internationally and prime the pump for a real big push. So when Stressed Out by 21 Pilots got big over the course of the last few months, I knew it was only a matter of time before indie pop leaning acts with borderline emo overwritten lyrics to start to creep towards the mainstream pop scene to provide the smarter counterbalance to Justin Bieber's whiny narcissism. Hence we have the band Lukas Graham. Now they released a self-titled debut in their native Denmark back in 2012. They got a huge reception there and pretty much nowhere else. And while I wouldn't say I was blown away by it, the writing definitely showed the signs of being a debut. The pop soul blend seemed a little bit too polished for my taste. It did catch the attention and ear of Warner Brothers, which put some backing behind their second self-titled album, otherwise known as the Blue Album in 2015, where 7 Years actually wasn't even the lead-off single. Yeah, that actually turned out to be the third single from that sophomore album, and then thanks partially to the success of 21 Pilots opening up the way, the song is now absolutely huge and pretty much everywhere, at number 2 on the Hot 100 as we speak, propelling Lukas Graham into the spotlight, and Warner Brothers desperately repackaging an album for mainstream international consumption. So on that promising note, how's the album? Well, honestly, it's a bit of a weird listen, and while it's not helped by a few songs from a previous release jammed into the middle of the album, the self-titled Lukas Graham record is a peculiar beast in modern pop, one that doesn't really have an exact comparison beyond an odd mishmash of 21 Pilots, Hebrews era Say Anything, and maybe a bit of Ryan Tedder's production style to boot. Overwritten lyrics, an incredibly earnest vocalist, and production that's far too smooth and polished for its own damn good. I'm not prepared to call it bad, but it does strike me as a release that shows a band that's not quite ready for the mainstream spotlight, or one that might not belong in the mainstream to begin with. Now I should explain, and the best place to start is the production and instrumentation. Now on the surface, much of this album feels very analogous to trends in modern pop. Gleaming keys and synths, punchy percussion, a smooth enough cushion of reverb to buoy up the occasional strings, but there are a few subtleties that deserve attention. For one, the nearly ubiquitous trap hi-hats in the percussion are nowhere to be seen, with many of the grooves coasting off of a bass guitar that desperately needs more texture to really hit for me. In fact, the keyboard melodies are nearly always at the forefront, clean and glistening to really stick in the brain for melodic hooks, including an organ tone on What Happened to Perfect that might be one of the brightest that I've heard in quite some time. So in other words, this is good. All the melodies are at the front, and that trend definitely carries over to the composition as well. Tracks like Drunk in the Morning and Don't You Worry About Me or Strip No More have these very jaunty, upbeat melodies that recall a little bit of vintage pop, or maybe even musical theater, the latter which definitely comes across in the production that rarely ever brings out real bite or impact. I mentioned Ryan Tedder before, and that windswept, very polished sound definitely saturates this album. And you know what? The bizarre thing is that when this record does bring in some modern vocal production for the backing vocals or around the edges, it doesn't fit in nearly as well. Between the high-pitched and thin backing vocals on Take the World by Storm, or the distorted warbling on the outro of You're Not There, otherwise pretty damn solid songs that I do like, or the child choir on the hook of Mama Said, you get the feeling that many of these tracks are a tad sanitized, a little bit too cutesy for their own damn good. There is bombast here. Some of the horns do connect. I like the gospel touches on Funeral to Closer, and when the strings can build a soaring power like on 7 Years, they got some real momentum to them, but too many of these songs feel a little bit thin, lacking the texture and a little bit more body to really stick with me. And that definitely does not help our frontman, Lukas Graham Forshammer. Now don't get me wrong, his voice has power and he's got enough swagger and charisma to keep me interested in his odd lyrical flows, but between the many points where he really pushes his range in the upper register and the vocal production that doesn't always let the deeper notes in his voice come through, he can get a little bit shrill and a little bit grating at points. What's more noticeable is that despite how clear his tone is, keep getting the feeling that this record is missing a thicker underbelly or grip that might come with actually having a guitarist, or at the very least some synths with more of a fuzz or an edge to it. As it is, much of his delivery can come across as a little bit broad, good for the stage maybe, but not quite having the emotive subtlety to hit quieter or darker notes, and this definitely comes through in the writing and themes. The most notable coming threefold. Lukas Graham is torn up by the loss of his father, who he constantly calls his daddy, which feels more juvenile than it really should considering how serious this album is trying to take itself, and it's led to the inspiration for him to find success, and he's concerned with losing touch with his roots in the grimier poverty, or with his own legacy going forward. You get all these notes playing through 7 years, which I'd argue, despite having some clumsiness and not quite hitting the classic status that Alan Jackson found with Remember When back in 2004, which tackled very similar subject matter and frankly did it better, but otherwise, 7 years taps into that nervous anticipation of the future quite well. It's probably the best song on this album. And when this record can tap into more of that drama, like on the thrill of Take the World by Storm, or the grief of You're Not There, it tends to do pretty well. Hell, even though the sequencing doesn't flatter this album, I actually like Better Than Yourself, Criminal Mind Part 2, where he writes about a friend in jail and trying to reconcile his friendship with the implied crime that this guy committed and how it nearly cost his friend his life and definitely his freedom. But you know what? That confidence, which can be an asset in this album, can also get kind of obnoxious. Most notably on Drunk in the Morning, where he doesn't even know which girl he drunk dialed for a hookup, and then proceeds to talk about both the other girls he was after and how he's only ever gonna call after two. Classy, dude, especially when it's framed like he's in the right here. Or take Don't You Worry About Me. I get the sentiment of trying to reassure a friend that he's on track with his life, but you'd think that he would at least return to including his friend in the conversation instead of just more bragging about being on track here. Or take Strip No More, a bit of a joke song where he falls for a stripper who decides to move on, and yet when he ends up in the song saying that she's not going to get tipped if she doesn't come back to him, it's clear that Lukas Graham's, in his mind, he still considers her a stripper, which is right up to the point of obnoxious for me. And while I know it's not entirely the band's fault, the sequencing of this album really is quite bad. Most notably the mood whiplash across a lot of the midsection, which does nothing for the overall vibe. But even at the very end of the album, where on You're Not There, he says he'll never truly be able to get over his father's death and full, they then end the album with Funeral, where he expects drinks in celebration when he himself finally passed away. It's a weird double standard, and it belies a certain cockiness of this album that I'm not quite sure can really pull off, especially in the cleaner instrumentation. It doesn't really back it up all that well. But in the end, man, this is a weird record to evaluate. On the one hand, I like the focus on melody, the lyrical cadences that lead to some strong hooks, and there is distinct personality here. But on the other hand, it feels overly broad in its presentation and the writing, and I keep wishing for more instrumental muscle to match our frontman here. It reminds me more than anything of a middling stage musical soundtrack. A lot of glitz and personality, but lacking the subtlety and texture to really grab me more deeply for a really great pop song. As it is, I'm thinking a 6 out of 10 and a recommendation, but 7 Years really is the best track here. If you like that song, the record's worth a listen. But otherwise, I'll be waiting to see age and time can bring out some of the edge in the production to match some of the lyrics. I think it could be there, maybe if they hired a guitarist, but as it is, just not quite there yet. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at? Well, I got a backlog. I'm gonna work my way through it. I will try to be catching up here. In other words, I also get the poll here. If you think I'm totally off base, I'm curious what your opinions on this album actually are. But beyond that, until next time, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.